All right, welcome back to Doctrines 2 as we continue on our study of systematic theology. We're going to continue on in Christology, the doctrine of who Christ is and what he did. We're going to be moving on into what he did specifically is considered the atonement, what Christ did in both his life and his death to earn our salvation. We talk about the word atonement, goes back to the Old Testament. That word atonement, the Day of Atonement, when we talk about the day in which the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies and make that one sacrifice that would cover the sins of the entire nation for the year. So that word atonement means to atone for the sins of the people, to make a sacrifice that would be acceptable to God on our behalf. And so that's really what we're talking about here in the questions that arise ultimately. Why is the atonement necessary? Why would Christ need to die for our sins? And ultimately that goes back to our study of anthropology of who man is, that we are totally depraved, unable to save ourselves. And that the punishment for sin is death, is eternal separation from God. Not only physical death, spiritual death, but eternal death. And so therefore, sin must be punished with the death of something, of someone. And so in the Old Testament, of course, the death of the sheep, the death of the goats, the death of the bulls. And so the blood of those things covered the sins of the people, but only for a time. Ultimately, God had as his plan that he would provide an ultimate sacrifice for all mankind, not just to cover the sins, but to remove the sins and allow man to come into his presence in complete perfection and righteousness. So ultimately it begins with the character and nature of God. As we understand the character and nature of God, the love and justice are the two things that we kind of see as opposing forces, but ultimately all of God's attributes are at one with one another. And so when we say, well, God does this out of his love, or God does this out of his justice, or his holiness, that's not entirely accurate. God does all things out of all of his attributes. And so the atonement is no different. It comes out of his love in that he wants to save mankind. He wants to reach out and love us and do something for us, that agape love, that self-sacrificing love that God wanted to do something for us. He wants us to be with him, but he also recognizes that man's sinfulness is not, we're not capable of being near him. And so his justice is saying, no, something else needs to take place in order for man to come to be with him. So the words here, love, God loved the world. He gave his only son. That ultimately the atonement is wrapped up in that God so loved the world that he gave out of that sacrificial love. But he also needed to satisfy his justice, God's holiness, his righteousness. Romans 3:25, whom Jesus Christ, God put forth as a propitiation. That word propitiation is also a word to satisfy the wrath of God. By his blood, in other words, his death, to be received by faith, this was to show God's righteousness. So the atonement itself, the propitiation of Christ's sacrifice on the cross, was to demonstrate or to show God's righteousness, his holiness, because in his divine forbearance, in other words, his love and his patience, he had passed over former sins. He went from the original sin of Adam and Eve in the garden, skipping over 4,000 years of Earth's history of people sinning. He passed over those former sins so that now it is to show his righteousness at the present time from the time of the cross onward, so that God might be both just, he might remain holy and perfect and righteous, but also be the justifier, be the one who can reach out to mankind and offer justification to human beings who do not deserve righteousness. We do not deserve justice. We are unrighteous. And so it's only by Jesus Christ's death on the cross that God can offer salvation to mankind and yet remain himself just. The atonement itself is absolutely necessary because God did not need to save anyone at all. When Adam and Eve sinned in the garden, God could easily have come in and said, all right, well, you sinned and your punishment is death, and they died. And if they had died, then they would have taken out the entire human race with them. You and I would never have even been born. 2 Peter 2:4, God did not spare the angels when they fell. When the angels sinned, God said, away from me, and they fell and are confirmed in their fallen state. And the demons will not be justified. The demons will not be redeemed. But to man, God offered up a way in which God could not only offer that in his love, but remain just as well. The atonement is absolutely necessary as a consequence of God's decision to save some human beings. See, if God had decided to save all, then God could not remain just if he just simply passed over all human being sins. And so he had to offer a way in which he could not only be just, but also be the justifier. And so in order for him to save some, he would have to offer salvation for all. Jesus says in the garden, just before he's arrested, Matthew 26 and Luke 24, if there be any other way, let this cup be passed from me, but not my will, but yours be done. In other words, it was the only way in which God could offer salvation to even some human beings. That's all we have for this video. Next video, we'll talk a little bit more about the atonement.